Hello, I'm Bradley Alisea from the Orthogonal Research and Education Lab, and this is an introduction to developmental embodied neurosimulation. And we have about 10 other people who are co-authors who worked on this in to various degrees over the past several years. So this is a poster showing the work involved in this developmental embodied neurosimulation approach. So it's a series of papers and other types of conceptual sort of summaries of what we've been doing. So we'll start from the upper right hand corner, we'll move around clockwise. So the first thing that we include in this paradigm is something called Gibsonian information. So you can see the diagram there where we have something in the environment. It's an external communication channel. It's spatiotemporally dependent information. Sometimes that's encoded in affordances. Sometimes it's just encoded in the structure of the environment. But in any case, that's encoded as a probability distribution, and it's sensed by the organism. And the organism or the agent, in this case, it could be a computational agent as well as an organism. And then within that agent, there's an internal communication channel, which usually is some sort of internal representation or internal transformation of that information. And then there's a decoding step where it's decoded into behavior. So you have things that come in, and this is very much based on the Gibsonian idea of direct perception, where you have environmental information coming into the agent. They act upon that environmental information. They maybe represent it, or more likely they just behave according to what they see and the types of stimuli that they experience. And so that's one aspect. We have a paper in the studies of computational intelligence on Gibsonian information as a concept. We lay out the mathematics and the use cases for that. The next thing I'd like to talk about is our work on developmental Breitenberg vehicles. So you can see that down the center of the poster here. And this is a paper that we just recently published in Artificial Life, which is a journal of the International Society of Artificial Life. And so this paper deals with how to build Breitenberg vehicles, which are these toy models of a computational agent that has sensors and effectors and some internal model in between. And with Breitenberg vehicles, it can be some sort of very simple wiring. But in this case, what we've done is we've introduced two innovations. The first is to introduce some developmental process, and the second is to introduce things that are maybe more complex than the simple sensor to effector mappings that the original Breitenberg vehicles had. So Valentino Breitenberg, who wrote a book in 1984, who laid out this idea. It was actually a thought experiment he had for simple, types of nervous systems like what you might find in a social insect or some other very small connectome. And he laid it out in this way. And so what we're doing is we're just extending this to some sort of developmental process where the agent is developing a nervous system or developing some set of neural associations, or in one case, it's behaving collectively in, having like these agents emerge collective behaviors from just them interacting with a stimulus. So this actually shows another aspect of this work, which is that you can develop agents from a single cell or a single egg to the adult body, and you can specify the different parts of the phenotype. So what's also interesting about this is that you have these embodied agents. So you can develop the body, you can develop different parts of the body at different rates, which we'll talk about later, and then you can develop this into a mature organism with a nervous system. You can expose the embryonic agent to stimuli, so it can shape its stimulus. According to Gibsonian information, it can shape its internal relations in an internal model. And that's very powerful, potentially. So we have one paper on that. And then, so the next paper I'm going to talk about is sort of the follow-up to that work, which is on the archive. And that involves continual embodied learning and developmental agents. So it's taking these Breitenberg vehicles and exploring what that looks like when we develop the body, when we develop the nervous system, and thinking about it in terms of continual embodied learning. So this is where you basically have these agents exploring the environment. They're embodied, they're developing their nervous systems, and there are a number of things that we show in this paper that are a little bit more sort of morphogenetic than the original Developmental Breitenberg Vehicles paper. So this is another exploring other avenues of this, and it's a more speculative paper. But as you can see on the bottom there, we do things like look at how if you have cells born and have cells die in development, and in the course of shaping that nervous system, what those kind of profiles look like. So how do we measure a lot of this, and how does it map to some of the behaviors that we see, and how does all of that contribute to learning? And to think about the agent not just as like this thing we put in an environment, but the agent from from basically an egg, a computational egg, to an adult, and then throughout the lifespan of the agent. So this is very useful in things like exploring environments. If you have a population of agents that need to explore an environment and map it out for various reasons, or if you have an agent that's like living in a household, like a Roomba or something like that needs to learn over many years. If you move the furniture around in a room, or if you move to a new house, it needs to learn those kinds of things. So the next part is this idea of Metabrain. So this is shifting away from these Breitenberg vehicle agents and shifting towards this notion of layering existing computational models in building these sort of brains, or building these sort of complex control systems, but doing it in a way that's layered, and the layers interact, and you have these sorts of complex nervous systems. So in our brains, in mammalian brains and human brains, we have layering. We have different layers of cortex. We have different layers of structural cell populations, things like that. And so we exploit these in our nervous system, or our nervous system exploits these for information processing. So in the cortex, there's 6 layers. In those 6 layers, there's communication between the layers, and it allows us to process complex information. And in the case of these kind of models, it's a little bit more abstract. We actually take things like neural networks and genetic algorithms and other types of models, like the contextual geometric structures model, which is a high level of cultural representation in a computational method, and then we connect those together in a way that allows you to process things from a very low level of representation to a very high level of representation. What I mean by representation is that it has like some sort of symbolic processing at the very high level of representation, and non-symbolic processing at the very low level of representation. So we might start with a neural network or a connectionist network and move our way up to some sort of highly symbolic processing. So this kind of is in the spirit of a lot of the hybrid models that people build, the hybrid neural network and symbolic processing models, the neurosymbolic processing models that people work on. So Metabrains for cognition and SemiNeuronal information processing. So we've written 2 papers on this. One was Metabrains for cognition, which is just basically like it's an agent-based approach where we just lay out the Metabrains approach, thinking about it in terms of brains for agents. So these Breitenberg vehicles will have, instead of just this connection between sensors and effectors, would have this layered nervous system between sensor and effector, and then high levels of representation. But we also think about this in terms of SemiNeuronal information processing, which is where you have maybe a system in the gut, or a system in the body somewhere where you have a mix of neurons and other types of cells interacting with one another. So you have in the gut, it's known as the mini brain. You have some local processing there. You have relays up to the central nervous system, but you also have other cell types doing things. You have muscle. You have all sorts of different biological, metabolic processes going on. So this is another aspect of this. And this is something that people don't really think about when modeling agents, because they don't think about these sort of semi-neuronal processes where you have neuronal processes, or this sort of neuronal processing, which we think of as the brain, but you also have the body. And again, we kind of are very explicit about what the body is. In the case of our development of Breitenberg vehicles, there are these bodies that get shaped through developmental processes, so we can affect the timing and the shape and the growth of these structures, and they have an effect on how the agent behaves, how the agent's nervous system is shaped. But then we also have these systems where we have, these interactions between the nervous system and the physiology, how it regulates the physiology, how the physiology regulates the nervous system, and its interactions with the physical environment, and even with other types of systems in physiology and in the environment. So this is a very interesting direction. So the final thing I'm going to talk about, and so there's some publications here. We have an the Embodied Intelligence Workshop. There's an ebook that we're putting this in. It's also on the archive. And then this other paper, which is on the archive, that will be in Presidia Computer Science. That's on the SemiNeuronal information processing. The final example I'm going to talk about is on intelligence offloading and simulating developmental agents. So you're simulating these developmental agents. Again, you have these agents that start out as an egg, and then they develop to these these embryonic agents. And so I show these embryonic agents here to show something that people don't think about when thinking about embodied agents, which is that they can develop a phenotype, and that affects the nervous system and how its world is shaped, but also that these phenotypes can be controlled by things we know about the biology of organisms. So in this case, we appeal to the idea of heterochrony, which is the control of growth rate and development. And so we can set out on different trajectories of growth, so different growth rates for the agent. So we can say that we want a small agent or we want a large agent, and then we can actually scale the brain or the nervous system to the body size. So we can have agents with a small brain and a large body, or a large brain and a small body, or any combination of those things. We can control those rates of growth in development, and it can result in very different types of agents and very different types of intelligence. But another aspect of that is that intelligence isn't all in the internal model or the control system. Intelligence can be out in the environment. And so this is where this paper comes in. It suggests that there's a model for offloading, which is where instead of encoding things in the brain, that things are encoded in the environment, or sometimes they're encoded in, say, like the shape of the body. So the ability to orient the agent to orient itself to different stimuli, the rate of orientation, and so forth. Those are all things that are involved in this sort of morphological computation. And then extending that out into the environment, you have objects in the environment that you can encode information in, either for the individual organism, the individual agent, or a population of agents. So we have examples here of a clock, of an hourglass, of a handle, of a lightning bolt. And these are all basically affordances in the agent's environment. And the agent encodes information. So the agent knows that when the hands on the clock are like this, it's 2 o'clock. Or they know that this has a handle because this is the part that you grasp and grab and pull. And so these are all things that we can do. We can look at the size of the nervous system and then say what's not encoded in the nervous system can be encoded in the environment. And so from this we can derive rules for deciding what's going to be in the nervous system and what's going to be encoded out in the environment. So that's our work on intelligence offloading. So this is a tour of what we've been doing. Thank you for your attention.